Recording. There we go. Okay, so two of the things I want to start to show you guys today, because I think because of the short week, it's going to be better to work with stuff we already know. We'll definitely, next week when we come back, I'll start to explore retopologizing with you guys, and I'll show you guys how to get Speed Retopo. It's a free add-on, and it's cool and useful, right? The Blender stock actually has fairly good retopologizing tools, but Speed Retopo is a free add-on that adds or takes stuff that Blender already does and puts a nicer interface around it. It's kind of like BPainter. Technically, Blender does all that stuff, but it can be a headache to set up some of those things. And so some people have built add-ons that just kind of do what Blender already does and just kind of automated it into a better interface, which Blender usually does a great job of, right? But occasionally, you know, it does need a better actual, like, proper texture painting layer system, even though the core painting tools are quite good. That's what BPainter offers. And Speed Retopo just gives you kind of some of the features, like the annotation tools can be used for drawing curves on it. So kind of, you know, some cool add-ons. And that's part of what the beauty of Blender also is. There's just such a great community out there making either free add-ons or really quite affordable add-ons. So what I wanted to show off today is really two things. I did want to show the new feature that's in 2.92. And I'll show kind of both ways to do it. That way, if you're still working with 291, you don't have to worry about it. But I also want to start to show you guys sculpting. And we're going to do basic sculpting, not hardcore sculpting. You guys might not even be ready for it. And we're going to keep working with it and going over it. And I'll kind of probably do some reinforcement of it this week and next week as well. But multi-resolution can be a cool way to kind of block in some forms. Because at this point, with this creature, we've kind of done all the big stuff that we can do with box modeling, right? We've got the arms, legs, toes on, the horn, and the mouth, and that's kind of usually what you could do. You know, if you wanted some other horns here, if you wanted like an ear kind of coming off of there, you know, you could pretty easily do those things with box modeling still. But there's certain forms and shaping that you kind of still would need to have available, right? So of course, if we wanted to, we could do a little bit of shaping. Maybe I kind of wanted a bit of a ridge form back here, so we could always kind of maybe take a few polygons and kind of give them a little bit more of a ridge back there, right? So remember, you can always do a little bit of shaping just with your tweak tool, right? And switching between edge and face mode just to kind of develop those maybe a little bit more, right? If we really wanted to, we could also quickly add a bit of an ear back here, right? Maybe like that polygon right there, Control E to kind of give a little bit of like an ear stump off of there. Remember, that's just Control E for extrusion, and then I'm holding down middle mouse button to drag, right? That gives us our drag extrude. This guy will extrude along the average normal, which most of the time I don't like. Sometimes I do, though. Sometimes that is actually really cool. So it really does depend on the context. For a character creature, I almost never use it because I'm going to be using view extrude, right? So remember, if you hold down middle mouse button drag, it just kind of extrudes and drags to kind of based on your view. Which actually is, yeah, it's a middle mouse button. So in this case, I can go back to the tweak tool, right? And I can just do a little bit of tweaking. And you see how we can kind of just create a bit of a simple ear form up here. So really what you do with your box modeling is just all the really big, easy stuff, right? Kind of all the core, large appendage forms. Box modeling could still do quite well, right? We see we kind of got a bit of an ear here. And we could always do little tweaks to the shape. There we go. And just a little something there, right? Now we've got a bit of an ear form in, kind of a bit of some humps there, right? So remember, you can always still kind of go in here and do a little more forming and shaping for what you want to do. All right, and I think that's cool, so I'll save that really quick. This gives me a little bit more, but really try to get all the really big stuff that you can do easily without sculpting, right? For me, that's kind of my method. Otherwise, you have to rely on automated retopologizing and Dynameshing features, which Blender actually technically has its own version of Dynamesh. It's dynamic mesh, and we have to kind of explore it elsewhere. But ZBrush does that. It allows you to kind of just block in without worrying about extruding, but it also creates just the most horrendous, ugly, nasty, inefficient, poorly edge loop mesh ever. Because it's basically brute forcing it, right? For me, I prefer to kind of do as much as I can box modeling, take a quick primary form sculpting pass, which I'm going to show you a bit of today. We probably won't even fully exhaust that today, but we'll get it started today. And then I can just manually retopo the parts I want to, because I already have a lot of the edge loops I want from the box modeling. So I actually do incorporate some level of sculpting for primary forms and retopologizing into this mesh. And we'll also use retopologizing to build like some gear and armor on this character. That's one of the things we're going to explore even more on this character creature than we did on our crab at the beginning of the year. But there's still so much you could so easily do through box modeling and your core tools, and you have already a strong base mesh with a lot of strong edge loops. And that's why I still prefer this, at least for the bulk of the building of the primary shapes for a character. Okay, so that's good. But before I get to there, I wanted to put eyeballs in, right? Now, there are two ways to do that. One is kind of the old way, and it still works pretty well. And I'll briefly show you that first. There is another way that's new to 2.92. And you remember kind of a couple weeks back, when 2.92 came out, I briefly just teased you this tool or feature. And I do want to show it here today so you guys could see it's an option available if you want to use it. But I'm going to show you both ways. But I want to get an eyeball in here. Now, one way is kind of like what we did with our steering wheel, right? In our car, we kind of explored it a couple times with our rims and our steering wheel. Remember, you can move your cursor, right? There's an actual cursor tool right up here, right above your move tool, right below your tweak selection tools, called cursor. And the quick key for that is C. And what that does is when you hit C, by default, it's set to kind of like a view, right? You kind of sit here, it's orientation set to view. So you just kind of click, and you see how it kind of will just kind of put it roughly kind of in the area that you want it to be at. So if I click right there, it'll just kind of put it roughly in that area, right? So cursor, if you hit C for cursor, you just click, and you can do other really cool things with it, right? You can kind of set it to use transform or geometry if you wanted to. You can even snap it to selections. We saw that a bit more of an advanced version on our car. Here, I just want it roughly in the area. That'll work for me. But remember, C for cursor, and you just kind of click in the view roughly where you want it to be at. That's good enough. And that way, when we go in here and we start to build something with this, so I'll hit Q for regular tweak tool, we can put an eye on. Now, in this case, I like to actually do it within the polygon mesh I already have. So I don't want to go to object mode. Because if I go to object mode, it can... I like doing it here and then separating it. So I'm already in this. What we can do is we can go to add, and we can go to UV sphere, right? And that drops in a UV sphere. Now, I can go to the options box right here, right? Remember, there's that little options box down here. I can click on that. And I don't want it to be this dense. So I'm going to set it to like 8 by 8, right? So segments is kind of one direction, and rings are the other direction. So segments and rings are controlling how many edge loops you have around this way and how many you have this way. But you'll notice by default, it is actually creating this on the cursor position, right? And that's kind of cool. And you'll notice that it's on both sides. Now, you'll notice that I have this faceted shading right here, right? Remember, we don't generally like that for most of our stuff. So if you just right-click, you'll see that one of your options, particularly if I'm in face mode, 3 for faces, so I'll hit 3 for faces. If I right-click, you'll see there is something called Shade Smooth. And that smooths the shading between all those polygons so it looks kind of smoothed out. From here, I could easily just rotate this, right? E for rotate. And I just kind of rotate it down there. Now, you'll notice you could use view rotate, of course. But you'll notice that if you left-click in the center of your manipulator here, it's kind of like a free rotate. That's not based on the view. So once you get used to kind of all of the functionality, R for scale middle mouse button, very quick and easy to kind of just do some view rotate, a little bit of scaling, and we can get ourselves kind of an eyeball right in there and kind of give it the angle we want it to have. And there we go. So that's kind of the old-fashioned way. And then, of course, we could right-click to separate selection so it's its own object, right? But using that cursor, it'll build it based off where the cursor's at. And because we're already in this edit mode, it'll build it as this object, and it'll use mirror and subdivision. So that is one way to do it, right? I'm going to hit delete. Oops. And faces. There's another way, though. And if you ever need to reset your cursor, remember what you could do is you could just go back to add mesh, and you can go to snap, cursor to world origin, and that kind of resets your cursor back to the origin of the object. So if you ever want to reset your cursor back to kind of that origin of the object itself, you can do that. So there's actually some cool stuff you could do with your cursor stuff in Mesh Snap. And we've seen some of that stuff too. The other way to do the eyeball is now this. Now this is specific to 2.92. So if you're still working with 2.91, use that first version, kind of the cursor, and then just kind of position it, and then you can separate it. But if you left-click drag, right? So if you hold down left mouse button on this add right here, it looks like a primitive wireframe with a plus. It's right above the extrude tool. So if I hold down left mouse button, you see I can add a cube, I can add a cone, I can add a cylinder, I can add a UV sphere. And generally you want to add UV sphere as your sphere, right? So we'll add UV sphere, and we'll do this in face mode as well. So you see I'm still in face mode for this, so that way it'll kind of add it to here, and then we can separate it. And you'll notice it gives us this little grid that's snapping to the surface. Now once again, I don't have to have it perfectly placed because I can do a little bit of adjustment later on. But if I start to left-click drag, it starts to drag out the sphere. Now, if I hold down Alt and Shift, you'll notice it kind of, Shift will kind of keep it uniform. Alt will actually kind of do it from the center of where you started kind of creating it from. So Alt-Shift, drag kind of about the size of the eye you want. And then, of course, if we keep holding down Alt-Shift, when I kind of go to drag again, it'll give it dimension. And then I can click, and there's our UV sphere. Now, you'll notice up here that you can easily go and change your when you go to create it, you can change those. But you can always go to this UV sphere here and change those. You can kind of see it's already using the segments, 8 and 8. But before you even create it, you can change those right there as well. So there are some options for it here. But that's kind of neat, right? It's kind of one of the new tools that you can use to add stuff. And you see I could just kind of add a sphere here if I wanted to. And you can just keep kind of going and doing it with any primitive, and it kind of tries its best to stick to the surface. And that's spheres, but it works with any shape. So it's kind of neat. I like it. I think it's pretty cool. But it is a feature specific to 2.92 of Blender. Right? So if you're in 2.91, you're like, I don't see that. 2.91 doesn't have it. You'd have to use the cursor method, which works pretty well also. So there are two methods, and I figured it'd be kind of cool to show you a kind of practical example of this tool. Now in this case, I can just kind of, set to W for move. You still always have to shade smooth, right? So make sure we're in 3 for face mode. Right-click, shade smooth. And then, of course, we can move this into place. Remember, F is your frame selection quick key, so you can kind of always set it to zoom in. And then, of course, E for rotate. And you can use all your different rotation functions. This is that kind of full free rotate. That's view rotate. You can always hit R for scale middle mouse button to scale it down. W for move middle mouse button. And there we go. Now, of course, we want this to be a separate object, so we can right-click, separate selection. And now we hit 4 to go to object mode, and we can see that that's now its own object. So I can go up here, and I can double-click to kind of say, let's just say quad eyes for now. Right? We can always relabel it later on. And you'll see what's cool by making it as part of another object. It already has the mirror and subdivision modifiers applied. So we'll actually take those with it when you separate, which is really neat. It's one of the reasons why I kind of like to do that, kind of build into an already existing object and then separate it, right? Because then kind of some of the things I already have are already on. I can get that nice placement where I want to. But now they're fully separated objects. All right. So one of the last things I wanted to start to show you guys today was sculpting, right? Today's lecture is really going to be one of those things where you guys might not even be quite ready for this yet, but that's okay, right? Because I'm going to review this later this week. I'm going to keep reviewing it as we go on. You're going to have this video to watch, right? So what I want to show you now is if and when you're ready, what we can do is we can actually take this mirror and subdivision and apply them again, right? So that way our base mesh is going to be denser, right? But you really want to make sure that all the stuff you want to box model is on it, right? That you have, you know, any horns, humps, eye, radial pattern, mouth, radial pattern, legs, toes, ear, kind of already on this guy, right? Now remember, I do have this kind of modifier tools add-on turned on. Remember, that's edit, preferences. Sorry, the light's kind of hitting my monitor weird. Add-ons, and you can go add things like, you know, modifier tools, right? And that's what this is right here. And that way I can just hit apply all, and that now applies that. And you'll see that that's now the base mesh, right? That is our low res, right? That's not subdivisional. And we're only at about 9,000 triangles, right? 10,000, a little over 10,000 if you include the eyeballs, right? So we now have a pretty good idea of what our final base mesh is going to be, right? We'll do a little sculpting. We'll rebuild part of this. We'll eventually add gear. But on this quadruped with the gear and everything done is going to maybe at the outside be about 20,000 triangles. That's going to work in just about every pipeline. That's one of the reasons why you should not necessarily be afraid when it's appropriate to use a subdivision surface modifier, right? You see that by keeping ourselves focused on the primary blocking and forms, we still kept this quite efficient, right? In fact, there's areas we could probably still add maybe an extra loop or two to the knees, maybe some of the claws. But this is a quite good base mesh that would work in just about any pipeline. Still quite efficient, but enough to give us all the primary shapes, enough to give us good deformation. So if you've got some good rules for working with subdivision surface modifiers, it's a great shortcut. Otherwise, you'd have to do this a lot manually. Or, as many people nowadays do, just ZBrush Dynamesh it a lot, and then try to manually retopple the whole thing, or rely on automated retopology tools, which are quite frankly questionable in terms of quality that they give you the final result for. That for me, I just try to box model as much as I can and then do a sculpting pass. So how do we do a sculpting pass then? Becomes a really good question. I think I'm going to save this as a second version just so I have a non-smooth version. So say 2. There we go. Never hurts to save multiple versions, right? Blender does have an autosave that I believe is on by default, so you can always kind of go back to recover. But in this case, what I want to do now is I just want to kind of get you guys to see, and we'll spend a couple more minutes since I'm not really going to have any more videos for you guys this week. I'm just going to spend another 3 or 4 minutes on this. What if I wanted to start to sculpt, right? Because I really feel like I want to do a bit more with the brow ridge area here and just get something a little more unique, get like a nostril, but something that maybe I didn't know how I wanted to box model, right? Maybe it's a little bit unique to box modeling. There are going to be parts of what you want to design in a character or creature that box modeling is not going to do a great job for. A lot of it will, right? But some parts it won't. So what I usually do is, like I said, do as much box modeling as I can, where we just extrude shape with tweak and our regular modeling tools. And then I'll take a sculpting pass. Now, we're not talking about the detailed sculpting pass. We're not going to add wrinkles and scales and all that stuff. We're still talking about kind of the primary shape, the silhouette form. So what I could do then is go to object mode. And there is a modifier. And we're going to see this a lot more on this project also, particularly when we do get to our much more detailed, high-level detail pass for this. It's called multi-resolution. This is how you do high-resolution sculpting in Blender. We've seen this a bit on our crab, and we even saw it a little bit on our furniture. We didn't see it on our car. It wasn't really terribly appropriate for our car. Doesn't mean you can't use it on a car, right? But it was just one of those things. We had so much to do with the car anyways. It's like, let's not complicate it, right? But there is a modifier when you go to add modifier called multi-resolution. So we're going to apply that. And what I'm going to do then is you'll see when we apply this, you can subdivide. And as I do this, what it's doing is it's actually going up in resolution now to 150,000 triangles, right? Now the nice thing is page down, particularly when you're in the sculpting menu, will do it. Now you could go to sculpting right here, right? So we just click on sculpting, and that takes us to kind of our sculpting viewport here. We can always go back to here to turn statistics on, so we have an idea of what our count will look like. But also, one of the things is, remember, if you go back to 4 or 3 for these things, you could do that. 5 is your sculpt mode, right? If you click on here, there is a sculpt mode 5. So you don't even technically have to go to sculpting here if you want to stay in modeling for the time being. More when I'm doing the final big sculpting passes later on, I go to sculpting. When I'm still primary shaping, I often stay in the modeling viewport. It doesn't really matter, though. But 5 will turn this on. So if you switch to something else, like 4 to switch between objects, right, you have to hit 5 again to go to sculpt mode. But it is in this pull down. See the quickie there? And what we could do now is make sure to turn symmetry on, right? The brushes have their own symmetry. So you go up here to turn on the symmetry for the brush. Because we don't have a mirror modifier, right? You notice how there's no mirror modifier? The mirror modifier currently does not work with multi-resolution. And so what I can do is in the left and right brackets will control the brush size. And of course, the radius is here, strength is here. Might even turn that strength down a bit. And you'll see what we could do is I can just left-click drag to start to sculpt some form in here that I want. Right? Control will inverse. So if I hold down Control, it'll kind of push in. Right? Left mouse drag will pull out. And it pulls out more or less depending on the strength. And you also saw it had to subdivide a couple times to get enough geometry. And if you want to go up a little higher, you can. But you'll notice we could start to kind of define a really interesting kind of ridge here that goes into our nostril as well. Right? So I can kind of define a full ridge that goes all the way from kind of the ear kind of into the nostril. Remember, Control inverses your brush. It is right there, though, right? Plus pulls out, minus pushes in. But Control automatically does the push in for you. And so one of the things you'll see that we could do here is this shape is kind of one of those shapes that I'm looking at it and I'm like, I'm not sure how I'd want to do that for sculpting, right? And so what you could easily start to do right now is go in and define stuff that's still going to be more a primary form shape, but something that you could maybe retopo later on or just do a little more shaping to. So anything that you're not sure of how you'd box model because kind of that form and shape, I'm not really sure how I'd go about box modeling it, right? That can be the kind of thing that you could easily do as a part of a sculpting pass. And that's just our default draw. The very top sculpting tool, left and right bracket, adjust brush size. Of course, the radius is right there as well. You can turn strength down. Control will automatically inverse so you can push in. And we just needed to make sure to add that multi-resolution modifier and subdivide it a couple times. Now, while you're in a sculpting tool, you could do page down, and that will go down to level 1 and back to level 0. And page up will go up. So this is now when we start to explore this idea of now we can start to do this stuff that maybe box modeling is not going to be that great at, right? So there are going to be certain forms that you might find just aren't as well handled by box modeling. And so that's where you can start to take a kind of neat little multi-resolution pass. Now, we're not doing the fine details, right? I'm still kind of focusing more on the big details. And what we can do is we can manually retopo just part of this face later on. I'm going to do a little more next week on this as well. So we'll kind of get to see and talk about this a bit more in some videos. But it's cool to kind of be able to take this pass on it. All right. I'm going to stop the recording there.